Good morning, everyone. We'll make a start. Welcome to the home of the Commission for Children, Young People and Child Guardian. My name is Barry Salmon. I'm the Commissioner. I'm the Assistant Commissioner. There hasn't been a coup this morning. Elizabeth Fraser was to be here to welcome Jatinder and to all of you, but the Commission of Inquiry has kicked off this morning and she's been invited to be part of the inquiry, so that's where Elizabeth is this morning. I'd like to welcome you to this launch. This is a world premiere. Actually, in fact, I don't think I've been to a world premiere before. It's great to have so many people in attendance this morning. I guess before we go too much further, in the spirit of reconciliation, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're gathering this morning. The Commission is delighted to be able to host the launch of this particular research report, Cultural Diversity and Child Protection. It's the work of Jatinder Kaur, who's a friend of the Commission and who we've known for many years now, and this work is particularly important to the Commission. The issues that Jatinder has identified in terms of the risk factors associated or that contribute to call children and their families coming to the attention of the child protection system are really important issues for us to get our head around. And just as importantly, we also need to give some real consideration to ensure that how our system responds to this group of children and their families is very, very important. So the work that Jatinder has done in this regard, we think, is very important. And as I said, we're delighted to be able to host this launch this morning. It's my pleasure to introduce Jatinder. Many of you are friends of Jatinder, and she really is a very passionate person, and particularly in this area of work. Her research report, Cultural Diversity and Child Protection, is the outcome of some significant work that she's done over quite a period of time now. In actual fact, Jatinder is the director of JK Diversity Consultants, that famous JK. When I think of JK, I immediately think of Rowling, but in this case, it's JK Diversity Consultants. For over 10 years, she's had experience working in the area of policy, research, as well as frontline social work practice. In 2007, Jatinder conducted the first research which explored child protection assessment frameworks used when working with called families in the child protection system in Queensland, and from that she developed the cross-cultural protection survey. Jatinder is doing some significant work not just at a Queensland level but also at a national level. At the moment she's a member of the National Framework for Protecting Children's Common Approach to Assessment, Referral and Support Task Force, and at the end of last year Jatinder was appointed as an independent external expert panel member of the Australian Government's Access and Equity Inquiry, which is part of the Australian Government's Multicultural Policy Initiative. So she's very well qualified, very well experienced, and it's my pleasure to introduce Jatinder to talk about her research. Thank you, Jatinder.
Thank you, Barry. It's kind of set the stakes really high now. Welcome everyone. First I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we are gathered here today. Also like to acknowledge the support of the Children's Commission in hosting this event today. This is the first of a number of launch events that I'm doing across the country. So we've got Sydney, Melbourne, Adelaide and Perth coming up. I guess this report and the launch of this report is it's a labour of love. It's even though it took a year to sort of write this, I feel like my journey started quite a number of years ago, back in about 2006, when I was a frontline child protection worker. So I guess it's important to sort of look at where I came from and where we are today. The research that I did here in Queensland was in child protection, looking at, I guess when I was as a frontline worker, I found that workers are really struggling to deal with the cross-cultural issues in dealing with different migrant and refugee groups, and their level of assessment in assessing whether it was a Maori family or a Sudanese family or a Muslim family was really different. So sometimes they would remove a child, sometimes it wouldn't. So that got me sort of looking at, because I was doing the master's research at that time, to really sort of look at, well, what are the child protection assessments, what are the decision makings, and what is the research out there. And I guess at that time there wasn't any research. So in conjunction with my supervisor, Karen Hilling, who, was a great mentor at UQ, we developed a survey, went out to about 10 child safety service centres across southeast Queensland, and interviewed investigation and assessment workers on how they dealt with working with culturally diverse families. And, it's a no-brainer, but the key findings were that, frontline workers really wanted to have training, skills, knowledge, wanted some guidelines, and really wanted to understand how to deal with the cross-cultural issues. So that was back in 2007. Fast forward 5 years, 2012. The journey has been interesting in the sense that, I've had highs and lows, but I guess what interesting thing that happened last year was that an NGO in Victoria looked me up on the internet and found my research and actually approached me to present to the Victorian Child Protection Inquiry. So that got me, I guess, motivated again. And in doing that submission, what I did was I actually looked at all the child protection systems, so not just from Victoria, but looked at all states and jurisdictions, looked at what policies and practices and legislative frameworks that were out there. And I presented to the Victorian Inquiry, did a submission, went down and travelled to Melbourne, and also provided a whole policy proposal to them. What happened out of that, I was the first person to actually mention that issue or bring up the issue of CALD and refugees to the Victorian Inquiry at that time. So prior to that, the panel members of that inquiry hadn't really come across that issue. And it led to them further investigate and talk to some of the NGOs in Victoria and actually really try to understand, well, how big is this issue, and asked the DHS, the department there, to actually start capturing some data. And they did that. So their final report was tabled in Victorian Parliament in February early this year. And they had a dedicated chapter, Chapter 13, which is actually looking at the needs of CALD children and young people in the child protection system. And it's the first time that a child protection inquiry actually included a provision and recognition of the needs of CALD and refugee children. They also had 4 recommendations, but clearly identifying that this was a huge gap. So the advocacy and raising the profile kind of, even though I had been doing it, since 2007, I think it kind of amped up last year, and then sort of really looking at the national framework stuff. So we'll go into the presentation, and I guess just before we go into that, I guess I'm mindful that today is the beginning of the 3rd child protection inquiry in Queensland. And we need to sort of really look at, well, what has worked, what hasn't worked, and also where there's been some really significant gaps. And certainly I know from the non-government sector, when the CMC inquiry was going on, that they had tried to include or raise the profile of the issues of CALD and refugee families. So I think, it's an ample opportunity, but also my main motivation to get this report out was to influence decision makers, policy makers, practitioners, and actually put the evidence out there. Look, it's about a 20-minute presentation, but I'm really keen to sort of get question and answers, so keep your questions on hold if you can, and then we'll have a bit of an interactive session. Normally when I deliver this, I actually do it over a whole day. I have a whole day training workshop. So I kind of take practitioners on a journey, so in the sense of looking at early intervention, prevention, child protection assessment, and out-of-home care. So it's a bit tricky trying to cram everything in a half-an-hour presentation, but bear with me, so we'll see how we go. Alright, so last year, one of the key actions that came about from the national framework was to undertake a research audit of all the available research. And what the research audit identified that was a significant gaps in actually understanding the cultural issues within the child protection system. That's what CPS stands for. And so as a consequence, they've been able to identify that, and one of the, I guess for me to be able to do this report was that I was able to receive some funding to undertake this research review. So this research review includes published and unpublished work. Having done my research in this area, I was also quite familiar and across a lot of the different research studies that have been undertaken in interstate jurisdictions, certainly in New South Wales and South Australia. But I also, through this process, a number of researchers provided unpublished copies of their research as well. So that's why it is a very unique document and a unique report that when we look at research, a lot of the time we only go with what's empirical, what's in high-ranking journals and is published. Sometimes we don't tend to look at what's been unpublished and would be quite relevant to what we need to know. So we were able to find about 13 publications across Australia from 1996 to as of June 2012. As you, hopefully most of you would know, the census figures were released on the 21st of June this year, which is from 2011 data. And certainly when you compare the 2011 data to 2006, Australia's cultural diversity has increased considerably, where 1 in 4 Australians are born overseas. You know, even though Queensland doesn't have a very large diverse population, we still do have diversity in our state. But obviously Sydney, Melbourne and Perth have a higher proportion of migrants and refugees settling there. There are over 260 languages that are spoken, and that includes Indigenous languages. I guess in Queensland we have quite a unique mix. When I looked at the census figures, it shows a higher proportion from the UK, but the UK has a large cultural diversity. I was born in the UK, so you know I'm not Anglo-white, so there's diversity there. And then New Zealand migrants, you would, for those of you who are grounded in practice, New Zealand migrants would also be from Maori, Pacific Islander backwards, Samoan, Tongan. So certainly we have a very large migration of Pacific Islander communities in Queensland in comparison to other states. And then we also receive refugee humanitarian entrants that are coming from you know, Middle East, Afghanistan, Iraq, Horn of African countries like Sudan, Ethiopia, Eritrea, and then we've got the Cambodia and Laos countries as well. So, as you can see, I guess having doing this work and researched and been in this field, is that there are some significant gaps in the child protection policy frameworks. And really that's come about from, I think, a huge disconnect. So when we look at policy and we look at how governments operate, whether you be state or federal, unfortunately they do work in silos. So you would have child safety on one side, you'll have health, you'll have police, you'll have multicultural affairs on one side. And the knowledge from the multicultural sector or the refugee sector has not necessarily influenced or had an impact on mainstream disciplines like child protection, social welfare, family support services. So what that has meant that there has been a real disconnect and a real sort of lack of knowledge and understanding about, well, how do we actually meet the needs of people that are from a CALD and a refugee background. So we're all here to talk about CALD and refugee children and young people in the child protection system. So the latest figures that were released by the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, which do a national child protection snapshot, identified that there's about 37,000 children and young people in out-of-home care, of which there's about 12,000 that are from Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander background. Now, currently, as yet, no one can tell you how many of those children are actually from a CALD or a refugee background. And for me, that's a really big gap, because even if we were to look at Queensland, and I put in because this talk is in Queensland, that you know, 7,000 nearly 8,000 children that are in care, and about 3,000 would be from Indigenous backgrounds. Of the remaining 5,000, how many actually identify from an CALD or a refugee background? And what happens is when you actually don't know the number or the proportion of children or young people or a community group that comes into the system, you actually have no idea how prevalent the issues are. So if you look at child abuse and neglect, then also you haven't developed policies or guidelines or practice framework to meet the needs of that community group. So that's why data is absolutely critical. This is not just in Queensland, this is across all states and territories. So I was in Sydney last week, and certainly meeting with some of the migrant resource centres in the western suburbs of Sydney, I was quite horrified to actually, some of the stories they were telling me, that the feeling on the ground is that probably more than 50% of CALD and refugee families are being notified and coming into the system. And this is in Western Sydney. So higher density, but also the system is also removing at a higher rate of people. So that's why it is an issue, and that's why I use the word hidden, because at the moment we don't know. So that's, I guess, a bit of a point that I'm making. So in the report, like I said, because I'm referring you to the report, it is a, hopefully it's a succinct enough report that it's easy enough to read. But some of the questions or comments I get back from bureaucrats and policymakers is that, well, why do we need to have a separate strategy for CALD or refugee families? Well, we're very different. We are different. Yes, we understand the Indigenous issues, we understand there's an overrepresentation and there's a need for focus for closing the gap. But the issues that are impacting on CALD and refugee communities are also quite significant. So it's important to also understand what are those differences and what are those issues. So when we look at diverse child rearing practices, there are a number of differences in comparison to Anglo-Australian and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families. There will be some similarities, but there will be some significant differences. Some of the key ones that do come up around gender roles, patriarchal societies, traditional practices, collectivist cultures, children are raised in a family instead of the Western individualistic parenting styles. So that's causing a lot of intergenerational conflict. We look at, relationships between children and parents. Some of the things that I do cover in the workshop is that if we look at attachment, now all the knowledge that is occurred and developed around attachment and our understanding about attachment is from a Western lens and a Western perspective. Now, we're using that knowledge to interpret how a Sudanese mother might be showing affection or attachment to her young child, or how a Maori mother might be showing affection to a teenager. That knowledge around, if we look at, for that instance, is not necessarily culturally relevant or responsive to those different cultures. So that's what I mean about the differences that we have. Discipline. Now, I'll go into more detail, but if we think about where we are in Australia as in contemporary Australia, the knowledge and understanding around physical discipline has increased over the last 30 years. So, I know, like even when I went to school, in the UK, my teachers were able to cane. My husband, he grew up here. He's saying that, his teachers were able to cane. So our knowledge and understanding from 20, 30 years ago has significantly changed. But the unrealistic expectation that newly arrived families will automatically understand what are the accepted Australian parenting norms or accepted parenting practices is quite unrealistic. And also we haven't done enough work to build that capacity and inform them of that. Concept of honour and shame. So in this book we have a table that looks at different examples drawn from the literature as well. So I've just put that out there. Now I like using this slide, so I have this in my training. This is a misdiagnosis that usually occurs, and actually when I was in Sydney last week, a lot of Vietnamese children were removed because of this practice, Mongolian spot. So in different cultures, particularly from the Asia Pacific region, whether they're from Asian culture or Indian culture, a lot of children are born with skin pigmentation, and it's called a Mongolian spot. It's usually blue. You can't probably see it too clearly, but it's a very dark blue, purpley sort of pigment bruise looking. And what you find is if the child protection workers aren't aware that this is a naturally occurring phenomena within that community, they will misdiagnose that as physical abuse without actually getting the information from the community or from the health professionals. Even some health professionals who aren't aware or across that may misdiagnose that as abuse. My youngest son had it. He had a really large purple bruise on his bum too. So it's a natural occurring phenomena. But it's really important as part of our training and knowledge that we actually understand that and recognise that when it's incorrect. So, like I said, I am trying to cover some big concepts, but I'm trying to lead into what will bring in, what are the issues that are impacting on CALD and refugee families, what is the research telling us, and then what are the harm types. So that's what I'm sort of leading into, just if you have those questions. Settlement issues. Now this applies to both migrants and refugee humanitarians. Now sometimes I find that the discourse or understanding is different, where a lot of people may not realise that even for migrants that are coming from India, China, Philippines, they struggle too. They have settlement issues, but unfortunately they don't have access to settlement services, whereas newly arrived refugee humanitarian entrants have access to settlement support. So that's where there's a huge discrepancy. And for refugee humanitarian entrants, they actually, get a cultural orientation. They get shown how the Australian system works, how to use the public system, how to go to Centrelink, where do you go to access your basic services. Migrants that come from, whether it's from the UK, English-speaking or non-English-speaking countries, don't get any of that orientation. And that was something also quite a strong issue that I did raise as part of the Access and Equity Inquiry, that the way the current Department of Immigration and Citizenship focuses its service delivery is very much skewed for the refugee humanitarian entrants. But if you were to look at the numbers, we accept close to 200,000 people under the Australian Migration Program. That includes the permanent migration and temporary residents. 200,000 in comparison to 13,500 refugee humanitarian entrants. So there is a bit of a disconnect when you look at service provision there and the needs. So those are some of the issues. Those are some of the issues that will bring families into the system, particularly when you look at cultural shock, rapid change in family roles. That's coming across quite significantly now. So certainly my work in Victoria has shown that even with some of the African families, the young people are learning the language, English, so much more quicker. And they are now taking over the role of the head of the family. And that's causing disempowerment for the parents and causing conflict. So they're asserting their rights, child's rights, they get access to youth allowance and Centrelink and, stuff use, I know what I'm doing, I can do whatever I want. And the parents want to maintain them within their own cultural perspective and traditional child rearing practices. So that's a huge disconnect. And what's happening, child protection is becoming involved. They get removed, placed into out-of-home care. Some of the perks of out-of-home care are that you have access to quite a lot of activities and money and entitlements. They get used to that, and then when we're looking at reunification, they actually don't want to come back. So that's another issue. That's a whole other practice circumstance that's happening out there, and no one's actually realising that we need to sort of work on that. We need to start working, we need to shift the focus to more around family support, early intervention, prevention, rather than actually dealing with the tertiary. I'm not disputing that we don't need the tertiary system, we do, but it should not necessarily be the be-all, the end-all, that a family should not reach that level to get access to basic family support. So, just some of what the literature is showing around refugee experience. I guess their vulnerability really comes across about their experience of being a refugee. And what does that mean? I mean, some of you are here from, refugee humanitarian settlement services, is that we really need to understand and unpack what are those issues. the fact that they've experienced torture and trauma, what does that mean? You know, when we look at post-traumatic stress, what does that mean on parenting capacity? What does that mean about functioning or level of functioning? And how do they display attachment? How does that impact on, you know, our requirements for them to settle successfully in 6 months, and they know how to go out and learn English, be able to go to Centrelink, look for a job, catch public transport within a very short time period? Are we being really realistic, or are we setting them up, you know, to a point where it's unfair and unjust that they're struggling? And usually my experience or some of the feedback that I've got from the grad is that when settlement services pull out, that's when a lot of the refugee families really struggle. And that's where you see a lot of the issues around domestic and family violence, intergenerational conflict, some of that post-trauma coming back, because that intensive support isn't there. And that's where I think your mainstream agencies need to start to look at, or are they, in their family support, reaching out to those community groups, or are they underrepresented in their catchment and in their service provision? So before I think what I'll just talk to, so in the report, there's been 2 major research studies in Australia. So one of the studies was done by Pooja Swarika in New South Wales, and she explored the interface of CALD families and the child protection system. So she actually did a cross comparison of Chinese, Lebanese, Vietnamese, Pacific Islander with Anglo-Australian and Indigenous families. 120 case files reviewed, interviewed frontline staff and carers. So it was a 3-year study that was done from about 2007 to 2009. So the references are in the report. So that was that study that was done in New South Wales. And then in South Australia, there was a large 3-year study that was done with the Australian Centre for Child Protection, which looked at newly arrived refugee families and the South Australian child protection system. So they looked at the cohorts of Middle Eastern, you know, Iraqi, Afghani, Horn of African families, you know, Ethiopian, Sudanese, Eritrean, and then also the Southeast Asia. They also did a comparison of Vietnamese refugees that had arrived earlier, and also newly arrived Vietnamese refugees, to do a bit of a cross-cohort comparison as well. They did focus groups with the newly arrived refugee family groups, and for 1 year, from 2005 to 2006, they actually did 12 months extensive data collection in one catchment area to look at what type of notifications and substantiations were occurring for newly arrived refugee groups. So actually looking at what type of harm types were coming in, and what were the issues, and then what were the outcomes of that, and, you know, whether children were removed. So, so that's just a bit of a background of those 2 studies. So in Swarika's study, so her literature review is available online, and it's also included in the list of references, is that she was able to identify these factors that brought families to the system and brought issues to the system. I think I've covered most of them, so I won't, but that's there for your reference. And then the risk factors for newly arrived refugee families as identified by the South Australian study were those factors. So communication, language, pre-migration, issues around domestic violence. Now, domestic and family violence is a serious issue. It's a serious issue in the fact that despite there being a national action plan on tackling domestic and family violence, there isn't really anything that's culturally tailored or responsive to meet the needs of CALD and refugee families. So what you have is, you have the domestic violence sector, which pretty much says that, you know, the women have to, you know, be willing to leave the perpetrator or leave the partner and actually go into a refuge, or, you know, that's kind of the system across all states. And you have ouster orders, or you have a DVO here in Queensland. But if you, the impact of culture and tradition and honour and shame, and when you think about the experiences of CALD and refugee women and some of, I guess, their cultural beliefs, it's not a simple thing as leaving their family. Because if they were to leave the house or their husband, they will be shunned by the rest of the community. And that's a really big step. That's a really, and what does that mean? And I think the disconnect in the system at the moment is that, my feeling is that the sector doesn't necessarily understand that nuances and those issues that are impacting. And that's why they really struggle when they're dealing with, you know, migrants and refugee women who are experiencing domestic and family violence. And look, certainly even with police involvement too, if police are called out to the house and they're not using interpreters, I've got to use police now, you know, and they're only taking the perpetrator's side and not listening to the woman's side, or even taking the issues that are impacting on the woman, that's a serious issue too. Because then you don't have a balanced perspective, you don't have a balanced idea about what are the real risk factors impacting on here. And you know, the fact is, we do get a lot of women killed too, and that's the severe end of it. But what leads up to that is probably over a number of years that the abuse continues. I think the other issue is around language. Language is a key barrier. If women don't know where they can go to access support, they're stuck. They don't know that there's a support service out there that they can go to, that there's a phone number, there's someone who's actually willing to help them. So they're kind of kept locked in, and that power control is there as well. So those are some of the key issues. So in the report, I talk into more detail about what were some of the presentations and the harm types that are bringing CALD and refugee families to the system. So this is a comparison of both of the two research studies. So both studies found that physical abuse was the common harm type across both CALD and refugee families. So that's really around strict discipline, you know, smacking your child, hitting your child, using implements. In severe cases, I'm aware that, particularly for, say, some of the refugee families who have experienced torture and trauma, unfortunately they have reenacted their trauma or torture experiences onto their children, where they have used cigarette butts, they have used implements, tied the children's hands behind their back with rope, or so whatever they experienced in the refugee camp, they have taken it out on their children. So that's been some of the the scenarios that have played out in physical abuse. Neglect. Now, neglect's come about from particularly inadequate supervision. So I'll give you a hypothetical. You've got a single woman or widowed woman who has 5 children. The oldest might be 13, the youngest might be 2. So, it's 5 kids. And now this is a single woman who, is from a refugee background, who has to, go to Centrelink, learn how to speak English, look for a job, do all those things that she has to do, and they've been reported to Child Protection because she has left the 13-year-old to look after her siblings. So in the Child Protection lens, that's been viewed as neglect. So those are some of the scenarios that have played out. And I guess for me, I would argue that we need to sort of have a look at, well, how does social exclusion work, and social support systems, and actually looking at, well, whether we need to, as a community, look at how we can link families who are isolated into neighbourhood programs or community groups that can help them, or even setting up a mother's support group so that they can still go to all these appointments, all these activities that they need to do, but not get reported to the system. So the next one is, so I've talked already quite into details around domestic and family violence. So the key ones are physical abuse and domestic and family violence. It's significant. Those are the main harm types that bring them into the system. Now, sexual abuse was really interesting because, and I talk a little about it in the report, in both studies, very few cases were identified that were around sexual abuse. But my concern is that that should not be perceived that sexual abuse doesn't occur in CALD and refugee communities. And certainly my experience of working in this sector, and even from my own community, I'm very much aware of certain grooming practices, checks and balances. If you look at all the issues around church leaders, I would suspect that no one's actually really looked at religious affiliated community leaders in the different other religions as well, and their access to children and young people. Because I can tell you, I don't think they would all have blue card checks. So that's a real issue. There's also been no research. And that's a significant gap. So the fact that there is no research done in Australia that's actually looked at sexual abuse within CALD and refugee communities and what does that look like, there's a significant gap. So then what that means that child protection workers who need to ask those difficult questions around whether sexual abuse has occurred probably don't even have a bit of a knowledge or an understanding about what things they need to be aware of. Now, some of the research from the UK has shown that frontline workers really have struggled and have left children in vulnerable situations when they haven't had the ability to ask those difficult questions. They've gone, oh yeah, well the dad looks really nice, he's well spoken, should be right. And they've left the assessment half. They didn't even ask the child. So those are the issues that we need to be aware of. One of the emerging things that have come up, and I also highlighted in the report because I thought it was quite important, is that I'm not sure how many of you are aware here, and around forced child servile marriages. So earlier this year, what happened was the Australian and Four Corners did a bit of an expose about an underground practice of child marriages occurring in certain communities, particularly they targeted the Muslim community in Sydney and Melbourne, and there were a number of child protection cases in both DOCS and DHS which involved the family law court. So what happened was that you had, within certain community groups, the young girl were not consenting to the marriage but were sent overseas to get married to someone else. So the Attorney General, Nicola Roxon, has brought in legislation. It's currently with the Senate committee right now, being amendments to the criminal slavery-like conditions. It's a criminal bill at the moment. And they're bringing in 7-year jail term if you are convicted of this offence. My argument is that that's all great. You need to have legislation, you need to protect the rights of the child, but yet you haven't done the other step. Community education, awareness. You actually haven't worked with those community groups where this practice might be relevant. You haven't built capacity. You dealt with that issue. You haven't sort of engaged even with the schools and the educational guidance officers who might have to have or understand these issues that might be going on in their schools. So I would suspect that that's going to be another harm type that will fall under sexual abuse. Yet the system and the policies aren't even around that. And emotional abuse was most common secondary harm type, but how that is presented, it will vary. Certain groups don't display the obvious signs of emotional abuse, of withdrawal and emotional effect. So some of the other findings from the South Australian study were around the challenges around parenting in Australia. I think I've already talked quite a bit around that, but some of that is around roles and expectations, the tensions between Australian laws and cultural norms. Now, if you think about it, a lot of the countries where a lot of these migrants and refugee families are coming from, there is no child protection system. There is no concept of a government authority coming into your home, removing your child, and asking you questions on whether you're a good enough parent. It's a completely foreign concept. So one of the key findings, when the research has looked at the experiences of families, it has been that they need to really get an understanding about what is child protection. There's a huge fear. Like I said, when I was in Sydney last week, as soon as you mention the word DOCS, they quiver in fear because it's been ingrained in them. That's all they do is remove our children without even asking us the questions. So there's a huge gap there, and we also need to explain that role and what the role does. What were some of the experiences of parents from CALD and refugee backgrounds with the system? Like I said, lack of awareness about what is child protection, their statutory role, fear of authority. If you think about it, they've come from countries and regime where they've been killed, maimed and tortured because of the government. They're going to fear any government, whether it's an English-speaking Anglo-Australian government or whether it's, you know, Lebanon or Syrian or, you know, any of those countries, and breach of confidentiality. I guess some of the key things that were brought up was there's a real need for early intervention and prevention and awareness around assertive parenting practices. One of the other emerging things that I tackle and talk about in the report is unaccompanied humanitarian minors. So, as most of you would know, the discourse now with the asylum seeker policy, the boats coming in, and you know the deadlock in Parliament, is that there's been a huge increase in the number of unaccompanied humanitarian minors, which has meant that they're placed, you know, initially they were in Christmas Island in detention and then released into community detention program. In Australia, though, there hasn't been much research that has explored the needs of unaccompanied humanitarian minors. You know, whether they're placed in the child protection out-of-home care system, or whether they're placed in a family setting or a youth residential model. You know, what are their needs? You know, they've been sent on a boat or whichever way to get here. What does that mean around, you know, the trauma they've experienced, the exploitation that might have happened on the way, their sense of adjustment, their fears, anxiety, and their settlement experience. So, huge gap there. So one of the studies that I did while I was in Victoria, I did some work with the Centre for Excellence in Child and Family Welfare and all the out-of-home care funded agencies, because one of my projects was down there, was that despite the department not having the data on how many CALD and refugee families, we thought, okay, well, we'll go the other way. So if the department can't find or tell us how many kids are in care, we'll ask the funded out-of-home care agencies. So developed a one-page survey that was circulated to all the funded out-of-home care agencies that provided foster, kinship, residential services across Victoria. And we had about 19 community service organisations that responded, which was about 2,500 children. So there's about 6,000 children that are in care in Victoria. So those are the stats, which is quite interesting. So when you look at Anglo-Australian, were about 1,500, Aboriginal was 258, CALD was 250, and the refugee, which is for the refugee humanitarian minors, was 30. So to me that's a little bit concerning, because that means that it's on par. So if we think that Aboriginal families, even in that sample, if we think that Aboriginal families children are overrepresented in the system, then that also means that CALD children and young people are creeping up to that same level. Now, the scoping study was also able to find in regions where there was a higher density of migrants and refugees, certainly in the northwestern region and the Dandenong region, the numbers were up to 20%. So that's quite significant. And then if you think about the fact that child protection might not have any policy frameworks, training, legislation, cultural support plans, then they're not even meeting the needs of that 20%. Some food for thought. All right, I realise I'm going quite over, so...
That's all right.
So you seem enraptured, so I'm going with it, so yeah. All right, so key messages that I'd like you to take back to your agencies and you know, be the next voice, because it can't just be one person, is that we need to collect data. So we need to collect data on CALD and refugee communities. We need to develop cultural responsive service delivery, specific to CALD and refugee communities. We need to really develop community education and awareness around targeting CALD or refugee communities. Now, we've got representatives here from MDA. One of the projects and one of the resources that I have been promoting through my travels is MDA in 2009 developed a really great resource, which is Safe Communities for Children. It's translated into 4 languages: Dinka, Dari, Arabic, Swahili, yep. And it's in a DVD format and in a written format, and it tackles those key things. What is child abuse? What is neglect? domestic and family violence, your family and child safety. It's actually developed in Queensland. And it's a great resource. So if you're working with community groups, that's what you need: early education, prevention, awareness. I mean, certainly when I've gone down south, they've been so excited. It's like, oh my God, we can run programs, we can run education programs, and actually show this DVD to families around what is the system in a language that they understand. So that's, my perspective, my framework isn't from a deficit perspective, it's actually trying to build capacity. So, you know, rather than saying, well, these are all the problems, here are some solutions, here are some strategies that we can do to tackle this. Certainly I have raised it with NAPCAN, who is a peak body around, you know, prevention of child abuse and neglect, that they need to develop translated resources around what is child abuse and neglect for all migrants and refugees. So that's a really good resource. Cultural competence training. I mean, one of the key gaps that I was able to identify was that for social workers, human service workers, or any workers that worked in child and family welfare setting, they didn't have training. I know from the university sector, they don't cover this. So last year I developed a one-day training workshop which has been endorsed by the Australian Association of Social Workers, which is a one-day workshop that covers the whole continuum of early intervention, prevention, child protection, assessment frameworks, and out-of-home care. I'm not saying that one-day workshop is going to give you the skill set, or you know, you're going to be a great practitioner at the end, but it's a starting point. It's a starting point to actually start looking at your practice, looking at the issues, and you can only start if you actually have the knowledge and the understanding. If you don't even know what the issues are, then I can bet you how your practice is with those families, you're going to struggle. And certainly that's been my experience with a lot of the workers. And I have tried to sort of work with some of the universities in actually trying to get them to embed some of that into the university courses. So certainly Griffith University have done that, and you know, been part of that project with them on cross-cultural practice in social work and human services. Do I need to talk about all that? Have I covered it? I think so. I think I'm going to stop because in the report I have a number of recommendations that I've put forward, and certainly part of my motivation was to get this report out now. The National Child Protection Framework is being developed for the second action plan, and I really wanted to be able to influence a lot of the bureaucrats and policymakers and practitioners to actually get this evidence out there. So that's been my motivating factor, that a lot of the arguments for against has been, oh, we don't have the data, we don't have the research, we don't have the evidence. Well, here you go, here's some evidence, here's some clear-cut messages that you actually need to include CAL and refugee families in the national framework. I think for Queensland, certainly I have met with senior people from the department and Minister Tracy Davis and Minister Rob Mollick. I think they are receptive to the needs. I think this Commission of Inquiry is going to be a very interesting process, and I think certainly it will be good to advocate as much as we can and put submissions in to highlight that in Queensland we do have this gap, as well as on the national level too. Yeah, all I can say is, you know, read the report, circulate it. It is free. It's available on the website. My main goal was to sort of bridge that gap and expand the knowledge, and I think I've talked enough now. So questions and answers, and yeah, we'll just go from there. Yeah.